My secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at iba pa. My name is Joe Bernardo, and I am here solo. I am interviewing without the other crew, but this should be a great interview, a great episode nonetheless. I am here with Stephen Acabado. He is an associate professor at UCLA in the anthropology department, and he is an anthropological archaeologist who is interested in the human-environment interaction and indigenous responses to colonialism. And he focuses on archaeology of the highland areas in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, specifically on the Ifugao rice terraces or agricultural terraces in kind of the northern Luzon area. So Stephen, welcome. Welcome to TFAL. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So let's just kind of get to the interview. You have been at UCLA how long now?
8
Well, years.
I started in 2013. Seems like just yesterday.
Yeah. And where did you grow up and then in the Philippines? And how did you get into academia?
So I grew up in Bicol. I was born and raised in Bicol. And I went to UP Diliman for college. So I spent 4 years in Manila. And then right after my BA in anthropology, I went to Hawaii for grad school. So I spent about 9 years in Hawaii. And my first job was in Guam. So I was in Guam from 2010 to 2013 until UCLA hired me. I got interested in archaeology. I think it has something to do with, in the 80s, that's when they were showing the Henry Jones Jr. Indiana Jones series. And so I think that got me into archaeology. And also that was the time that when my dad brought back a set of children's encyclopedia. And I was just starting to read. And the very first entry that caught my eye was archaeology. It's an A. So it's one of the first entries in the encyclopedia. So I got interested in archaeology at a really early age.
Oh, wow. So did you, was your father involved in it, or did you have any family members? This isn't something entirely new to you?
No, my dad and my parents wanted me to be a Catholic priest. So that was the dream for me. And at one point in time, I was exposed to a very devout family, and then anthropology happened.
Oh wow!
So when I went to UP, then I focused on anthropology and archaeology.
So what's the kind of real difference between archaeology and anthropology? Because I understand like archaeology is more about digging, right? And like looking at material objects. But anthropology, I guess in the classical sense, it's more about like studying cultures of peoples. So like, why is it so intertwined?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a topic for anthropology or archaeology 101. So we'll have to look at how the discipline developed in the United States and in the Philippines. So if you go to other parts of the world, let's say the UK or Japan, their archaeology is an extension of history. When you're digging, when you're investigating the past, you're looking at the past of the same group of people. Let's say Japanese archaeology is an extension of Japanese history, the same as British archaeology, British history. But when they brought the discipline to the United States, if you're an archaeologist, then you're looking at the history, the deep history of Native Americans.
Mm.
So there's a what you got, a cut in his historical historiography.
Is it kind of like is it a bit of a racial divide then? Is it because it's a Native American, then it becomes a different discipline or something?
It has a colonial foundation, and even in other parts of the world. So anthropology was used to understand indigenous peoples that they really don't know the culture, the history, and so on. And in the United States, anthropology became a four-field discipline. So you have the anthropology as the larger discipline, and then you have four sub-disciplines, and one of those is archaeology, and the other three are cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. And all four of those are meant to help scholarship back then to understand Native Americans in the Americas.
Got it. So, I mean, how did you, you talked a little bit about how you got into archaeology, but were you digging in your backyard, or were you interested in material objects in general, or and you talked about Indiana Jones Jr. Did you feel that you were going to go into adventures like that?
Let me think. Actually, probably no. I had a regular childhood. So I grew up in a very rural area in the Philippines. My parents won't see me after breakfast. They only see me at home, and it's time to eat. I actually most of the time I'd have my lunch somewhere else with my friend's house. I'll be outside. But if you think about it, it's probably part of that fascination with adventure, because I'll be out of the house, and then I'll be in the forest or in the river or in the ocean, playing with friends, and thinking about my experiences as a child in Bicol. Some of my plans in the archaeology of Bicol was actually influenced by what I saw, thinking back, in some of those childhood adventures, crossing the river, things that my parents don't really give permission to. But yeah, so I think I've seen a lot of potential archaeological sites in my childhood, and I've just started doing Bicol archaeology.
Oh wow!
So that as part of my the new direction of my work, looking at how indigenous Filipinos responded to the arrival of the Spanish.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because there's been some scholarship on archaeology in the Philippines, but I feel like a lot of kind of during that time period, during the initial contact with the Spanish, it's mostly historians have been looking at written records and whatnot. But yeah, there's not too much, at least what I've read on archaeology in the Philippines. Can you tell us kind of the history of archaeology in the Philippines, and what researchers have found so far, and that kind of tells us about kind of the history of the Philippines?
Yeah, so the archaeology of the Philippines is relatively younger than our peers in Southeast Asia, or not as extensive as our peers in Southeast Asia. And that has probably something to do with the absence of monuments. So if you go to Indonesia, at least the main islands, or Cambodia, or or Thailand and Vietnam, they have this temples that got an early start in documenting their past. While in the Philippines, we don't have much of monuments, so we didn't have that early archaeological work to document heritage sites. And professional archaeological research did not start until after the establishment of the American colonial government in 1898. Before that, you have Europeans, Blumentritt, but these are mostly historians and not really professional archaeologists going around the country collecting materials and documenting potential archaeological sites. And there are several French, German explorers doing some what we might call survey now. So previously, archaeology in the country was an antiquarian endeavor. So it's mostly going around and collecting materials, and that's been the idea, the general understanding of the wider Philippine population of what archaeology is. Again, mostly Indiana Jones, and so it's not about understanding our past, but mostly associated with treasure and something. What's this? Associated with treasures and fortunes, not about understanding our past. And when the United States took over in 1898, they brought in anthropologists, archaeologists to lead the documentation of the country's past. And that was the time that they brought in H. Otley Beyer, the father of Philippine anthropology.
And I mean, would you say the absence or relative absence of archaeology as a field, or just a limitation compared to other Southeast Asian areas, what would you say it's very like Orientalist in nature? It's because there wasn't any kind of temple complexes, predating Spanish in the Philippines.
That's one, and also number two, there was so after the Philippines got its independence, we didn't have like a regular national museum, a state-sponsored research project. And so what has happened is that the National Museum was there, and the National Museum is the only entity allowed by law, even today, to conduct archaeological research in the country. And so there wasn't, I think only UP has a program to train future archaeologists, anthropologists. And so we didn't have the same heritage preservation, heritage conservation programs that we see in other parts of Southeast Asia. And again, that's probably mainly because of the absence of temple complexes.
Okay, got it. And Otley Beyer, he was the one who kind of came up with the migration or the wave migration, correct?
Yes. So he was. He wasn't the one who initially thought of using the distribution of ethnicities in the Philippines. So before him, there were two European scholars. I think it's Blumentritt and Montano, who suggested that there were waves of peoples who came to the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Bayer came in, he articulated this model into to archaeological modeling. Basically, that's based on the distribution of the Negritos in the interior of the mountains. And then you have the Swedeners, or what we call Kaingan people, on the foot of the mountains, and then the rice cultivators along the coast. So that model is intrinsically racist because you are looking at you're associating the color of the skin with technological sophistication. But it was a product of its time, but it doesn't justify the use of the model. But they're not based on any archaeological data.
But it still kind of has this popular, people still gravitate towards it in the popular amongst many Filipinos and Filipino Americans.
It has something to do with our educational system. It really hasn't been changed. I'm not the first one, and most certainly not the last one to criticize that model. Again, in the 1960s, you have Hocano and other Filipino anthropologists who really fought for the changes in our historical narratives. But textbook production is big business. So it's hard to change.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that in so many countries. So I wanted to, kind of get into your research, and you research in the Ifugao region, particularly, around the Banaue Rice Terraces, and the origin of the rice terraces has been kind of passed down, or like orally, or maybe through textbooks, saying that these rice terraces are 2,000 years old, and they are an example of pre-colonial ingenuity that is lasted through this time. But your research actually debunks this, the origin of the rice terraces. Can you tell us about your research and what that tells us about the indigenous people in that area?
So that model, the argument that the Ifugao or the Cordillera Rice Terraces are at least 2,000 years old, is based on the waves of migration model by Bayer. Because he suggested that the Ifugao are probably the second wave of Malays who came to the Philippines during the Metal Age, so about 3,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago. But because it wouldn't fit the model of lowland Christianized, Islamized coastal rice growers. And then you have the Ifugao and other Cordilleran groups in the highlands, but they're rice cultivators, but they're not Christians. And so he made the model fit the distribution of peoples that he observed during his time in the Philippines. And so the argument, again, the long history model, is based on that idea that you have waves of people passing through the Philippines and establishing communities in the Philippines. And then later they became part of the colonial, Spanish colonial empire. And so there's no scientific evidence that would suggest that the terraces are at least 2,000 years old. They didn't do any archaeological excavations, and so that also became part of our national narrative as Filipinos, because again, we don't have this we don't have the monuments, temples to be included in our historical storytelling, historical narratives. But we have the terraces, which are this same in stature and the energy required to construct this large scale terraces. Temples. And so when Barton and Bay, actually it was Barton who said it first in 1919, although it's probably because of his relationship with Bayer. Both of them were pioneer American anthropologists, and they were in the Philippines from early 1900s. Bayer lived in the Philippines until his death, and he has Ifugao families. He married an Ifugao, and he has Ifugao descendants. And so it became sort of gospel truth in the Philippines, because although people in the 60s, again, you have Henry, you have Keesing, even William Henry Scott, and other historians and anthropologists during that time, and in the 60s and 70s, questioning the validity of the 2,000-year-old model. There wasn't an archaeological basis to say that the terraces are much younger than previously thought. Keesing, for example, look at all the early Spanish accounts, and he didn't find any that talks about the Ifugao Rice Terraces until 1801. And if you've been to Ifugao, if you've seen the terraces, these are something to write home about.
Yeah.
But there was a total absence of any descriptions of the terraces. We can't say that the Spanish have never been to that part of the Philippines, because they've been there since 1735. They were going into the interior of the Cordillera, but they never wrote about the terraces.
Yeah, if you go there, you can't not talk about it if you've seen it for the very first time, right? And it's if you're documenting your I guess the exploration, you have to talk about it if it did in fact exist.
So it could be that the Spanish were never able to penetrate the interior, but there are other rice terracing system in the Philippines too. So it's not just Ifugao. You have rice terraces in Tayabas. There are rice terraces in Bicol, of course, in Iloilo. But the difference is that it's more widespread and expansive in the Cordilleras and Ifugao. And so our archaeological excavations that started with my PhD dissertation in 2007, suggesting that there was that rice terracing probably expanded exponentially after 1565, after the arrival of the Spanish. There's no evidence of wet rice or the rice that they grow on paddy fields earlier than 1650. We also don't have any evidence of grasses. So if you have paddy fields, you're also expanding the environment for grasses that live in the same environment as rice. So even though you're not finding rice, but if you're finding the evidence of those grasses, then you can use that as a proxy indicator for that environment for rice to grow on. But we're not finding that in Ifugao. And of course, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but there are multiple absences that will support the long history model for the origins of rice terracing in the region.
So what did you actually go out there in your project to find Like what did you discover there that helped to debunk, the origin myth of the rice terraces?
So we were trying to look for evidence of rice, wet rice. Of course, there are dry rice. We know that so there are two types of rice in the Philippines. If you've heard the term upland rice, that's the dry rice, and that doesn't need irrigation. It's mostly from Sweden fields, from Uma.
So that's a slash and burn.
Yes. No. The term slash and burn is mostly, there's a pejorative term, so I try to avoid it.
So yeah, Sweden. Yeah.
Sweden, or we call it kaingin.
Okay.
But what got us into, so what were they eating if there was no rice? That was the question of the community. And I said, the probably taro or gabi, and archaeological record actually suggests that they were eating taro from the establishment of the village, maybe even after they started planting rice in the terraces. It was hard for the community that I work with to accept that fact, because they've been bombarded with that information that the terraces have been there for at least 2,000 years. And also, even more for most Filipinos, we don't have any evidence of rice cultivation in the country earlier than 1300s. And for most Filipinos, that's hard to believe that rice is a new introduction. When I was in college, I would be ordering burger with rice on the side because
we eat so much rice.
Yeah, if there's no rice, it's not a meal; it's a snack.
Yeah.
And so with our work in so not just in Banaue. So I did my dissertation research in Banaue, and most of my work focused on this early village in the town of Kiangan, the old Kiangan village, which is an abandoned village. The Spanish wrote about it. It was the village that the first Spanish account mentioned, the village of Kiangan. But for some unknown reason, it was abandoned, maybe after 1832, because the Spanish were sending punitive attacks, at least 8, to punish the Ifugao for attacking their garrison down in Nueva Vizcaya and Isabela. But in 1832, there was a report that Colonel Galvez burned the village, but they would have returned when the Americans took over in 1898. The town was already abandoned. I mean, the village was already abandoned, but the people in the present day of Kiangan, the Americans encountered, mentioned the village of Otbobon, which is the old Kiangan village, and so they still know that the village was there. And so when the community asked us to excavate the village in 2012, if you don't look at the ground, you wouldn't really see if there's anything, if there's any indication that it was a village that had about 4,000 people.
Mm. So then why was or why do you kind of conclude that the rice terraces were actually in response to, Spanish aggression, Spanish, colonialism?
So the argument is that there were Ifugaos living down in the Magat Valley, and these people in the Magat Valley were rice cultivators. And the Ifugao who were living up in Kiangan and other parts of Ifugao were producing taro. And so they were probably producing taro in irrigated taro terraces. And so there would have been terraces back then, but not for rice. So similar to what you'll see in Hawaii with the lo'i, the taro terraces. But of course, the cultivation of taro and rice is very different. And with rice, you need to have a very detailed knowledge of the landscape, of water, of the life cycle of rice. So when people started moving up to the mountains to avoid the Spanish, and moving away is an active form of resistance. And so that move alone is already a response to consolidate their resources, their political and economic resources, for them to be able to fight off the Spanish. So if you have rice cultivation, if you're producing rice, you have a more stable source of food, because rice can survive years. So its shelf life is much, much longer than taro. Taro and even kamote, sweet potato, would probably survive for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, unless you process them. But with rice, we've documented rice surviving for 10, 15 years. Of course, the nutritional content would be diminished, but people can still eat them. But that's not actually what we think happened. We think that only the elite was able to access rice the whole year round. And it was the shift to wet rice cultivation that allowed for this social organization, the cohesiveness of the culture, to be able to fight off a more powerful army. When the Spanish initially went to Manila, where Intramuros is now, the village that they encountered there only had about 2,000 people. When they went up to Ifugao, the old Gangan village had 4,000 people, and about 2,000 more in 3 smaller villages around it. So the population alone is much more dense, and and then you have the shift to a more maybe rigid or ranked social organization, and so you have maybe not formal leaders who are calling the shots to militarily repel the attacks of the Spanish.
But not all Spanish colonialism was done militarily, correct? Like there was a lot of kind of negotiating or wheeling and dealing, for lack of a better term, with like different like leaders, especially in the lowland areas.
Yeah.
Why was it different in kind of the highland areas?
It has something to do with the attacks of the Ifugao. So if you look at the history of the Philippines and Spanish conquest and subsequent colonialism, so it's mostly a resource extraction. The Spanish never wanted to be in the Philippines in the first place, because it was too far away. It was so expensive to administer. So at one point, there were probably only about 2,000 Spanish, not more than 2,000 Spanish in the country. So it was really an overseas outpost. But because the Philippines became important in the trans-Pacific trade, because there was a demand for Chinese products in Europe, in Spain. And so the Philippines, through the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, became like an economic port.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why Spain wanted to keep the Philippines, correct?
Yeah,
yeah.
And also, they thought that they could use the Philippines as a staging ground for conquest of Japan, China, Cambodia. But they failed. And when it failed, then they decided to go into the economic potential of the Philippines. But the Philippines didn't have that much gold, not much products that they can profit on. But during the tobacco monopoly in Cagayan, you have those plantations. So they had to transport the products from Cagayan Valley to Manila. And so they have to pass through present-day Nueva Vizcaya, Isabela, and those are the traditional hunting grounds of the Ifugao. And so they were attacking the supply route between Cagayan and Manila. And most of the towns that you see in Nueva Vizcaya right now, Bagabag, what are the towns there? So just right on the lowland, those were garrison towns established by the Spanish to protect the supply route. The reason why that part of the Philippines became the lingua franca became Ilocano is that the Spanish brought in Ilocano from Ilocos from the other side of the mountain range to populate those towns.
Oh, that's so interesting. Wow. Totally learning so much stuff.
Did I answer your initial question?
Well, I mean, I'm a student, failed student, I guess, Philippine history. But even dating back to Magellan, Lapu-Lapu, like there was always the Spaniards became relational to the datus or the chieftain, the leaders, and in order for them to consolidate their power, they would go willingly team up with the Spaniards to help colonize the rest of the areas or rest of the population, and so not just militarily, Spanish was they were very sneaky in terms of trying to when they were colonizing the Philippines. So why wasn't it the same way in Cordillera?
They actually did. So they sent. So there were several strategies that they attempted to quote unquote pacify the Cordillerans or the Ifugao, but most of them failed. But towards the end of the Spanish occupation or colonization of the Philippines, and then in Ifugao, they sent in missionaries. So the Catholicism and at least in Kiangan and Lagawe, they established a semi-permanent presence. What happened is that we've been using this idea or in history textbook, the explanation that's been used to explain why the Spanish failed to conquer the Cordillera is the relative isolation of and the mountainous terrain. In some way, it contributed to that failure of the Spanish, but it's mostly because the Spanish didn't see the advantage of the profit behind it. There's nothing there, then you just send people there to spend resources when you have the revolution happening in the lowlands. So it has a wider political ramification for sending more resources up in the mountains. And also most of the people that they sent up, their army are mostly Filipinos or Filipino lowlands.
Wow, so interesting. And it has to a lot of it has to do with timing as well, right?
Yeah.
And because I imagine missionaries were trying to go there all the time to try to convert the local people.
Yeah, the first group of missionaries, I think the first two lost their heads.
Oh wow!
And later, when the towns in Isabela and Nueva Vizcaya were firmly established, they were able to have more communication with groups up in the highlands.
Got it. Wow, that's so interesting. So when you actually share your research and you're telling these kind of narratives that debunk the kind of nationalist myths, what are people's reactions to it?
So initially, at least in Ifugao, they say, "Oh, we know that," based on community stories. But when I tell that in a lowland setting, some academic colleagues would frown on it because no, it's not based on any let's say documentary sources, but they said it's archaeologically supported, and it's my interpretation, and it's also supported by community stories. So that movement from lowland to highland, there is a town in Ifugao, Asipulo, and a village where elders still remember stories from their elders about moving out up in the interior every time the Spanish would show up.
Oh, wow.
And so that's still within the generational memory. The main issue is the dating of the terraces. I think that was because it's part of our colonial scholarship nationalist narrative, where the fetish of or the romanticism of older is necessarily better.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first thing that I needed to break the myth or demystify that model, or that 2,000-year-old model. And so to make it work, I had to work with the community, and so the community archaeology approach, working with the communities themselves. Then we discussed the findings and asked them about their interpretations. And so we meet halfway. This is my scientific explanation, and then this is the community stories. Then we try to come up with a narrative that's more empowering to the local community.
Yeah. So can you talk more about that? Because there's been, at least in the history of archaeology and anthropology, they've been accused as being, they're being reinforcing colonialism. There's been accused of perpetuating so many injustices, such as like extracting culture, the white savior kind of complex. And you talk about kind of a community approach. What is that approach? And, what are experiences of, people who work on that approach, through that approach?
Well, I'm very fortunate to have found someone interested in what we do in the academic side of things. So the collaborator, the Ifugao co-director of the Ifugao Archaeological Project, Marlon Martin, when I initially approached him in 2011 and then 2012, there was the first field season. Yeah, he was ignoring us, and because Ifugao is one of the most studied, probably the most studied ethno-linguistic group in the Philippines, and even maybe Southeast Asia as a whole. And so they're used to scholars coming in, jumping in, and then leaving right after they get the information data that they need. But then I showed up again the next year, and showed up again the next year. and now, even though I don't have any active research, I visit to show that it's a long-term relationship. So community archaeology it means that the community is actually actively involved, but the challenge is how do you get them involved, because archaeology is a very esoteric discipline, again associated with treasure hunting, and it doesn't help that the last stand of the Japanese was in Ifugao. So every time you excavate, they would joke about, nah, actually, it's not a joke. Sometimes they think it's real, that they're looking for the Japanese gold, or the gold.
Yamashita's gold.
Yeah, Yamashita's gold. And so community archaeology is something that it's hard for a lot of archaeologists, because a lot of my colleagues don't really have this long-term research project in just one area. You have to move from one place to another. And so with community archaeology, the goal is to have the community participate actively, and for the archaeologists to relinquish control of the research, some form of control, like research questions, interpretation, and that's hard for a lot of us, because we have our own biases, we have our own goals, and sometimes they don't conform with the needs of the community. So with community archaeology, we have to be always aware of what the community wants out of this and what they will get out of it. And it's just one step, and the next step is to develop their own capacity. So the indigenous, we call it indigenous archaeology or local archaeology.
So what do you think was the benefit of the community when you're basically, you're debunking the whole the age of the rice terraces? What do you think how do you think that benefited the community?
So right now, the initial, it will take maybe my lifetime to change the whole narrative, but we're getting traction. So we established the Ifugao Community Heritage Galleries, and that now serve as the Ifugao the Indigenous Peoples Education Center in Kiangan. So we have several galleries that talk about that serve as a venue for younger generation Ifugao and the community to talk about their history and their heritage, something that they don't learn in school because of the nationalized history curricula. So Ifugaos learn about Rizal and Bonifacio, but they don't learn about their own struggles with colonialism. So it's some form of a community museum, and there's a lot of private museums in Ifugao, being one of the most visited tourist regions in the country. But I've never met an Ifugao who visited a private museum, let's say in Banaue, on their own. They'll be visiting them, but if they have tourists to bring to the museum. But the iPad Center, the galleries were established with the community in mind, and so it's for the establishment of that center, again, I think is a testament to the need to involve the community, to learn more about their heritage. So in terms of my own work, it doesn't really matter if people think that they're 2,000 or 200 years old, because dating is just secondary to what you want to do. What we want to do is to maintain the knowledge of the past, the heritage, especially how to again refocus the conservation of the terraces to its cultural context. Most of the conservation efforts that have been done starting with the UNESCO designation. We're mostly on the infrastructure, repair of the walls, bringing in money to construct roads and so on. But they failed to acknowledge, or maybe to recognize, that the terraces is just part of this complex culture, and so without the input from its cultural context, then, well, it's in danger of, we're in danger of losing it.
It's amazing. I mean, that's great that you're working with community with Marlon, what's his name? Marlon Martin, yeah, to really help educate and preserve that history, and preserve the history of resistance that gets elided because of the nationalist narrative in the Philippines. Speaking of nationalist narratives, many Filipino Americans, right, and others in the diaspora, especially second generation, third generation, they're seeking, their identity, and it kind of, they didn't grow up speaking a Philippine language, and they don't know the history of the Philippines. And then once they start learning about the history, they start to cling on to like nationalist narratives. For example, the Rice Terraces are 2,000 years old. Indigenous people, IP with capital I, are the original, quote unquote, original Filipino, and we have to be like them, or there's this kind of this attraction to something that is pre-colonial. Anyways, all these kind of nationalist myths have pervaded a lot of Filipino Americans, and there's been much debate about, especially Filipinos in diaspora, appropriating non-indigenous Filipino and Filipino Americans appropriating indigenous people's culture. For example, Filipino Americans' consumption of indigenous people's clothing, the tattoos. There's a huge industry of getting a tattooed from Wang Od, right, up in the Cordillera. What's your kind of take on this whole kind of debate and these issues that are kind of coming forth, and these conversations that are coming forth amongst Filipino Americans?
I'll probably take it's a debate, and it's an ongoing debate, and it's very political, and it pits the diaspora with Filipinos in the Philippines, but for me, it's a good thing that the diaspora recognizes a part of their indigeneity, but at the same time, they also need to think about crafting a identity that's more, say, what's the term? An identity that would strengthen their tie to their ethnicity, because if we keep on taking the term appropriating indigenous Philippines and their culture, but at the same time, they're not profiting from it. They're just trying to look for a basis for their identity. Then the problem is that lack of sources of information, maybe heritage education within communities. I've been working with UCLA Filipino heritage students with the space the Samahang Filipino, and also I have students who does the SPCN, the Samahang Filipino cultural night.
Yeah.
Yep. And they talk about that the the problem with using indigenous dances. And I don't think it's just here. I don't think it's just the diaspora. Even Filipinos in the Philippines also use the indigenous practices to talk about original Filipino-ness, which is it's racist. It's because it has a connotation that indigenous peoples don't change, that indigenous peoples are isolated, which again the archaeological record and community stories refute, because we now know that they respond creatively to the pressures from colonialism, and even today, the rapid assimilation of indigenous peoples to the wider Philippine society. But in terms of the use of indigenous Filipinos cultures, again, I think it's not problematic for me. It's just that they need to know the foundation of that practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the like you said, the lack of heritage education, that many people are just kind of grasping for anything that they find that speaks to them for some reason, right? I also think like Orientalism kind of shapes that lack of identity, quote unquote, or the kind of need to go pre-colonial, or not to take in consideration the colonial history of the Philippines in that identity. Yeah. So, you've done great work in terms of, changing these narratives, really uncovering a lot of needed, knowledge in the field, and knowledge of our people in the Philippines, especially indigenous peoples. You mentioned kind of in the beginning that you are from Bicol, and you're doing like a Bicol kind of project. What's that about, and what's kind of the feature of that project?
So I've been working in Ifugao. That's where I established my academic career. But at the same time, I wanted to take some kind of giving back to the region where I grew up in. Also, my parents. When I established the Bicol Archaeological Project, I wanted to spend more time with my parents, because when I work in Ifugao, I would only be in Bicol for maybe 1 or 2 days, and then I'll be gone. And so there's a personal basis for working in Bicol, but also trying to understand these diverse responses to colonialism. So on the one hand, you have the Ifugaos actively resisting and maybe accommodating some part of colonialism or Spanish colonial aims. But you have the Bicolanos who are documented to have cultivated rice. According to the Spanish, there were only 2 regions in the Philippines that actively produce wet rice. That's Nueva Vizcaya and Bicol. And also the Spanish described the Bicol groups as the most, or the fiercest warriors they've ever encountered. But within 2 years, the Bicol became part of the Spanish Empire. And we think it was because of a conscious decision to ally themselves with the Spanish, because of the fragmented nature of Philippine polities during that time. That they were fighting against each other, and the Spanish came with a promise of guns, of a more powerful army. So they thought that they would be able to maintain their status if they are part of the Spanish Empire.
That was kind of a reference to my earlier question. about differences between like the Ifugao, how they resisted colonialism compared to for example, Bicolanos, and they were more, I guess, accommodating or allied with the Spanish. Yeah.
Yes. So what we see now is that, yes, even though the Bicolanos became part, they became part of the Spanish Empire within 2 years, but you see maintenance of, let's say, religious practices. So they're Catholics, but there's a maintenance of being Bicolano in terms of religious practice. Of course, food. We've seen that up until the 1800s, a lot of these two sites that we excavated, they maintained their food, their diet, that was based on ocean resources. So there are, just like the issue in the diaspora, that a lot of second, third generation don't speak the language of their first generation, but they still eat adobo, they still eat sinigang. There are other parts of our culture that are manifested in our daily existence. We just don't think about it because it's not as visible as speaking the language.
Mm-hmm. I do have a question about Bicolanos. How did spiciness get so much part of the diet? Obviously, coconut milk is very abundant there too, but why spiciness?
That I don't know, but it might be because chili peppers were introduced by the Spanish from Mexico. So chili peppers are not endemic to the Philippines, but I think pico was one of the more Hispanized. Of course, other areas in the Philippines would say that, but at least for now, when I think about Bicol, like the language, it's easy for me to learn Spanish because maybe 10-20% of our lexicon is Spanish. And so it might be because of the process of Hispanization that chili pepper, sili, was introduced, and a lot of types of sili. And of course, you have coconut milk, which actually counteracts the effects of the oil in coconut milk, counteracts the effects of capsicum. So,
wow, that's so interesting.
it's still spicy, but it won't stick in your
no. Yeah, totally. I love lying. I love Pickle Express. I love that stuff. But I just we're at the end of our interview, but thank you so much, Stephen, for Professor Acabado, for joining us. And can you let people know where to find you on the internet?
Yes, thank you, Joe, and for this opportunity. Actually, this is one of my advocacy is to, now that I work in LA, probably in California, with about how many Filipinos? 1.5 million Filipinos
in California, yeah.
And in LA County, I think 500,000.
Yeah.
And so one of my goals is to do this kind of work with the diaspora, and maybe in the next few years develop an exhibit here at UCLA at Collyer Museum, or maybe somewhere else to provide a venue for the diaspora to think about our heritage. And so the reason why I started writing in Rappler and Inquirer is to train myself into this kind of public scholarship, to break that division between scholarly writing and public writing, and also to help me write my book that's understandable for most people. But I'm at UCLA. I have a web page that people can check. If you just search my name, Google search my name, I think it will see up. But in terms of social media, I'm on Twitter. I think Stephen _ Acabado. That's my Twitter handle.
Excellent.
But
Excellent.
I'll be here.
Great. Well, thank you again. That's one of the reasons why, we started the podcast was because, we did want to bridge the divide between, I think it's also manufactured divide, but put forth a lot of the ideas that academia is producing into a more popular audience. Of course, we had different academics come on the podcast, and thank you for being another one, for coming.
Thank you.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Collado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.